All right, thanks, Glenn. So the last 2 years we started working with can we dragline soybeans. It started out as the idea of can we dragline double crop soybeans. So we're encouraging growers to plant wheat so that they could change that manure application window, move some of that manure application into summer, a time where we didn't have a growing crop typically, an agronomic crop out there if it was after wheat, and a time we weren't applying a lot of manure. It's usually drier out. One challenge we got and a lot of pushback comes from they really want to grow double crop soybeans after wheat. It makes sense. Economically, it is the answer if you're going to grow wheat. Wheat isn't a highly profitable crop, but if we can grow double crop soybeans, it works out very well. So producers were asking us, we want to get those soybeans planted as quickly as possible. How late can we apply the manure? Well, from some preliminary work we had done, talking with a few different commercial applicators, some things we had done on my home farm with the dragline, we knew we could apply manure before the soybeans came up. We knew the day they started necking through was the day we needed to stop. But how late could we go? Could we actually start applying after they had started to leaf out? So this trial really started without putting any manure on. We went to 2 different research stations and started looking at just the pressure of that hose. Is it going to break the soybeans off? What kind of damage is it going to do? And then we started working towards adding manure into that equation. When we get to the end, we'll talk about where we plan to go with that. So the first thing to look at is that soybean growth stage. Kind of like corn, it's very important. Many of you, really, soybeans are easier to stage probably than corn. Many of you already know these growth stages, but that VE, when they're first emerging and we have that neck on, a soybean's very fragile with that hypocotyl. It breaks off easily with pressure put on it. And when we break off the hypocotyl, a lot of times we're going to kill the soybean plant. We get that first leaf, unifoliates, VC. Soybean's still fairly fragile. We actually haven't tried the VC growth stage. We've just kind of assumed that we're going to kill the soybean at that point. But then we started looking at the next set of growth stages. Anywhere from V1 to V7 is where we've done the work of actually pulling the hose over the soybeans and looking at yield and tractor tire damage and drag hose damage to these plots. Fairly easy. Once we get past the unifoliates, we just start counting fully emerged sets of trifoliates, true leaves that are fully emerged, and however many sets of trifoliates we have, that's the V growth stage. End nodes on the main stem, you can count that node also as fully developed leaves. So the first set, this is the first year, it's kind of what we were doing in the plots. See the tractor going through, it's got a traditional row crop tractor. We didn't take a little garden tractor or anything out there when we look at tire damage. And we're dragging that hose. It's a fully loaded 5-inch hose, just like we did with the initial work on the corn, full of water, pressurized to make sure it's hard, just like it would be if it was full of manure. And those soybeans look a little tough after we get done going across the field. You can tell they've been smashed over. If we zoom in a little right there, you can see some of them are actually look like they're broken off. We would expect we were killing soybeans. We didn't do stand counts like we did in corn. What really matters at the end of the day on soybeans is what's the yield. We know from a lot of other studies that we lose soybeans throughout the growing season from planting till harvest, and we can still see excellent yields. So we're really honing on what the yield damage was going to be. A lot of these plants look like they're bent over, possibly broken off. Here's a close-up then. One of those plants a few days later, you can start to see it's starting to neck back up and come up, even though it's basically sled runnering across the ground and it looks like it's broke off right there and should have decreased nutrient flow. Looks like we should have been hurting yield. And the first year, it was really wet, so we thought that might have been the reason. So we're going to look at 2 years of data. A little bit closer zoom in. These plants have really turned around or growing back up. Look like they're going to thrive, even though down here you can kind of tell they were broke off and they had that healed wound. So the first year, the 2 different places we worked, up the Northwest Research Station up by Custer, we had a check. We yielded about 64 bushels to the acre. And then without putting everything together, we looked at the right side, the left side, and the center to see if there was any difference in the hose. The center has that tractor damage. These are small plots, harvested with a small plot combine, so we could look at what the tire damage was also at the different growth stages. So we can see at V1, we did have some tire damage, but it wasn't significant compared to the check. And you're going to ask, so where they were pulled over, we see an increased yield compared to the check. Was that significant or important? There's just a lot of variability across the field. You can see that over here on the right side at V1, it has the same yield as the check statistically. You move to V3, again, we're not really hurting yield compared to the check. You see a little bit lower yield where the tires ran, but no different than that check area where we didn't have any tires, no drag hose damage. And we went to V5, you see very similar results again at V5. We're not really killing those soybeans. We're not hurting yield by pulling that drag hose across them. What did the weather look like up at Northwest Ohio? In 2018, we saw slightly above average rainfall throughout most of the growing season. The historical, slightly below for 2018. We're slightly below historical, but basically right on. So we saw normal rainfall at Northwest Station. We go down to the Western Station. Things were a little bit different down at Northwest for rainfall, but we see a very similar trend, and from here we went check, V3, V5, and V7. We see basically no difference in soybean yield across all the different growth stages while we were smashing soybeans. And V7 was basically at this study corresponding with R1. These plants were starting to flower, and we were out there smashing them with the drag hose, breaking them off, and yet they were able to recover and come back. At that Western Station, if we put them together, instead of having everything averaged apart, you see that there's not a significant difference. We see a little difference between V3 and V5, a small yield loss, but no different than the check. So we're not doing that damage. What did the rainfall look like? This is what we hypothesized was why we were able to go all the way to V7 and didn't hurt yield in 2018 down at Western. You have your historical rainfall and the cumulative for 2018. We had high rainfall. If that plant doesn't have moisture stress, it's probably going to be able to recover better from the damage and the stress we did by driving over it and smashing it down with the hose. Moving on into 2019, here's a set of plots. There's some grass pressure in there. That's not really the take-home from it. You can't see where we ran at harvest. Well, this isn't quite at harvest, but pre-harvest. Those soybeans are looking good. As we move down and look into the canopy, though, we can find that we have the sled runner going on, and the plant turns and comes up, and we basically have pods laying right down against the ground. This was that V7 application. So we're expecting to see some yield loss, especially since we have pods down against the ground that we wouldn't expect to be able to pick up with the combine.
Where they were snapped off before they continuing to look at soybeans that we dragged with a 6-inch manure drag hose full of water. These beans were dragged. For this set, we actually got a different hose made. We're using a 6-inch now down at Western, so we're a little bit heavier than the 5-inch we were using originally. How that plant is growing horizontal.
This one here is not pressed against the ground quite as tight. It's up off the ground just a little bit. Depending which way we combine, we may be able to pick that one up a little bit better.
See very much of this, but
in case the videos didn't work, had a still picture here that shows that soybean plant turning, growing back up. So what were the results coming out of 2019? Down at South Charleston, down at Western. Check, we had decreased yields. These were planted later than traditional. Just because of the weather and the way the Ohio weather decided to play with us in 2019, we weren't able to get in and plant at a normal time. And then we actually saw drought scenario late into the growing season that probably hurt our yield. Check, 37 bushels. We didn't have all that moisture like we did in 2018, and we did see a significant decrease in yield at that V7 growth stage. We didn't do hardly any damage at V3, V5 when it wasn't any significant damage. When we got to that V7, again, we were starting to hit the reproductive growth stage, and we did actually cause some damage to the soybeans, saw a decreased yield of about 7 bushels to the acre. Looking at that weather, we come up here to the cumulative. We planted right about here, and you can notice about a month after planting, Western got really dry, and we were running well above on precipitation, but basically it flatlined. And towards the end of the year, they're actually below their yearly average for total precipitation down there. So Northwest Ohio, what did the soybean yields look like up there? We had our check, 56 bushels. Didn't see a lot of difference between where the wheels ran statistically and where just the drag hose was at V5. At V7, we did see some significant damage to wheel tracks, but not to the drag line. So where it was only hit by the drag hose, we really didn't see that damage to the soybeans, but but where the wheels were, we were definitely seeing a significant loss in yield. But again, that's only 6 feet of that header width. So if we were running a commercial manure applicator, if we were using tracks or something, so we only had one set of tires going through the field, what would the damage actually be if we were looking at a 30 or a 40-foot applicator? Because that's what's really going to matter to you, isn't what our one strip was. What's that 30 or 40-foot applicator look like? So took those and extrapolated over that 30 or 40 feet with one set of tractor tires. 40 feet, check, would have been about 56 bushels to the acre, whether it was 30 or 40 because we weren't driving through it. V5, 55.3, 55.0. The applicator width really didn't matter because we weren't causing any damage with that tractor. V7, 59.2, 52.1, so that width from 30 to 40 feet didn't make a big difference. And you also don't see a statistical difference in yield by going out to V7 with those taking out the tractor tires, since we're on that wider machine than just looking at exactly where the tractor ran. But still, it would probably be recommended that we try to be in there V5 to V6 growth stage. So 2-year summary. What have we seen so far? What worked and didn't work at the different growth stages? V3. There was 2 treatments at V3, 2 different site years. Both times there was not a significant difference in yield between the check. There was never a time where it was significant. V5, 4 different treatments to look at, 4 different site years. There was never a significant difference in yield compared to the check. But when we get out here to V7, it gets a little sketchy. Just like when Glenn talked about corn, as that corn plant got larger, it was hit and miss. Sometimes we would do damage and really hurt yield. Sometimes we wouldn't. When we got up to that V4, V5 in corn, it's very similar in soybeans at that V7 growth stage. Twice we had yields that were the same as the check, and 2 other times we saw a significant loss in yield. So that recommendation, probably V5 to V6 would be the ideal time to have that manure on by. If we look at western, northwest, was there a difference between western and the rainfall events? There definitely was. Northwest just continued to stay wet, had plenty of moisture all year long, but still we saw that significant yield loss at V7. We probably went from the opposite way. Instead of being drought stressed, they were just flood stressed the entire season. So what are the effects of liquid swine manure on a growing soybean? This isn't Ohio work. This is some work pulled from Nebraska. Swine manure has a high salt content, and we know salt can burn the soybeans. So this is going to be the next stage of putting this all together, is going to be to start looking at actually putting the manure on the growing soybeans and studying that and seeing, does the damage the drag hose did, does that increase the potential for salt burn? This study looked at V3, R1, which would be about our V7, and compared that. And was there a significant difference? And then manure electroconductivity was a measure that they used to look at how much salt was in that manure. They took one sample and they diluted it down, but we could also test our manure pits and figure out what our salt content was, what that electroconductivity is. And we're looking at potentially doing that on a couple barns here this summer. They went from basically 0.6, which was their straight water treatment, up to 20.3. They actually did a survey here in a few slides that looked at the levels coming out of hog barns in Nebraska and the damage that did, and they found that at 11.7, they weren't seeing any significant damage to those soybeans from the manure application. But if their electroconductivity got all the way up to 20.3, at V3, the soybean wasn't as resilient as it was at reproductive stages to high salt content actually, but still they significantly decreased yield at V3 and R1 with that high salt level with the manure application. That study, a few pictures from it. This was that 20.3 application. You can see they killed most of the soybeans in that V3 growth stage. R1, it burned the tops off really bad, but it didn't actually kill the plants, but it definitely stunted them back. So their study looked at 2,700 hog barns and was comparing what the electrical conductivity was of the manure coming out of those confinement hog barn, all finishers. There's a big difference, but you can find about 80% of their samples fell under that 11.7 for that electrical conductivity salt measurement. So that's fairly promising that a lot of our barns are probably going to be falling on that lower side with the potential that maybe we can actually apply this manure to soybeans. You wouldn't want to be applying it to that same field that you drag lined with the corn in it the year before. because that field, if you're following those recommendations Glenn talked about, to hit your nitrogen recommendation, you're actually putting enough phosphorus on for 2 crops. But it would allow you to rotate to a different field. It would allow you to expand that double crop window, potentially get the soybeans planted in the spring if your commercial applicator wasn't there, come back and apply this manure to the growing soybean then a few weeks later in the spring, and just adjust your windows some and apply to different fields. We definitely would probably want to start thinking about testing that so we don't hit that 20.3 and kill the soybeans. So we started to look at this. We used a tanker for year 1. We didn't exactly have our distribution set up very well on it. You can see the tanker did some significant damage to the soybean crop. It would not be the ideal way to do this. Drag hose is probably the answer. That tractor is much lighter than what the tanker is, going to cause a lot less damage. We'd burned the soybeans pretty good. We move here to this slide. You can see there's our tire tracks, and over here it had a higher application streak. It wasn't right after application these pictures were taken, but you can see we definitely did some damage, burned some of these soybeans. If we can get a better distribution pattern, which is going to be our goal for 2020, hopefully we don't have that burning. We can start looking at this a little bit closer. So what are the real next steps? Where do we go from here? We have that yield data that tells us we can pull the drag hose over. So next we need to look at the yield data from actually applying the manure, look at what rates we can use, do that study to figure out what our electroconductivity and salt content is in Ohio, and start applying it, determine on how high can we go. Probably don't need to go over that 5,000 that we're putting on for corn, but where is that sweet spot on rates with the salt content we have? See once does that drag hose damage and putting manure on, since we're going to be doing 2 stretches at once to the soybeans, decrease that growth stage that we can go to. Is that going to cut us off probably that V3 or V4 growth stage, maybe 5, and not let us go to 7 on those certain years? And then that recommendation of testing was looking around. You can do some commercial labs or just a simple electroconductivity tester. Costs somewhere in the range of about $100 to $400. So if you are going to go out and apply to your field, that's a lot cheaper than 40 acres later burning the entire field off. Actually testing and knowing what the salt content of the manure is.